There are many great videos here on YouTube about the use of miniatures in terrain. How to craft them, where to buy them, how to paint them, lots of great stuff out there. But so far I haven't come across any videos about theater of the mind. So to change that, I've decided to make my own videos. And to start with, let me compare the two approaches to RPG combat. Miniature combat versus theater of the mind. Miniature combat is pretty straightforward. You've got a bunch of pieces representing the characters involved in the combat and a bunch of map pieces representing the terrain of the combat. Some people make and use amazing custom miniatures and craft custom terrain, which has become more accessible than ever through the advent of affordable 3D printers. So if you like crafting and painting, or you've got a lot of money to throw at the problem, you can put your means into these miniature worlds and put something really impressive on the gaming table. So at some point I actually wanted to use some miniatures, so I got this Conan board game, got it on Kickstarter, because it's just got tons and tons of miniatures. So I paid like $1 for these miniatures. These are pretty good. Also, at the same time, I was planning to run the Conan the Barbarian RPG. These miniatures would have been perfect for that. I also promised myself I would paint these eventually, but they're still on my grey pile of shame. Didn't get around to paint them yet. But what miniatures really actually do is that they make it very easy to keep track of the characters involved in the combat and keep track of the terrain that the PCs could use to gain a tactical advantage. It makes combat easy to follow and tactical. But the terrain also takes up a lot of space on the gaming table and it takes time to set it up. So most people don't use it outside of combat. You don't actually need it for every corridor in your dungeon, or better yet, for the town and tavern that the adventure starts in. Something like Dungeon Craft's Ultimate Dungeon Terrain is all you really need to keep track of everyone's position in combat. Heck, when I started playing, we didn't have any terrain or miniatures really yet, just a piece of paper, maybe a combat map, and then we would use any token we could find to represent the characters and the NPCs and monsters on that map. Now, if I want to get more fancy, I've got this whiteboard with both hex grid and square grid, and I can use dry erase marker to craft a bit of terrain on here, or maybe some dungeon hallways and rooms with chests and a bunch of barrels. So one of the characters might just be this stone, this might be the dwarf, and yeah, coin, the wizard, the rogue, and a firelighter for a small dragon that is in the room. And these were the miniatures we used. So to make up for all the miniatures and terrain you don't have or you don't want to bother to use, you use your imagination. Yours and your players. Also, your ability to describe what is happening. Most people will be happy enough to use theater of the mind outside of combat, but really from something as abstract as Ultimate Dungeon Terrain, it's only a small step to use theater of the mind, even in combat. Now, there are some obvious advantages to this approach. One, you don't have to buy or craft or paint any miniatures or terrain or bother to carry them around to your game or set them up. But there are also less obvious advantages. Since in Theater of the Mind, combat is only happening in the players' minds, with nothing on the table to distance them from it, there's less of a barrier between the character and the player, making the scene more personal. It also becomes harder for the players to see what is actually going on. That might seem like a disadvantage at first, but it can be a boon. A real combat situation, or an action movie for that matter, combat is usually very short, frantic, and chaotic. It's easy to lose track of what is going on while you're trying to survive and beat the enemy that is right in front of you. So, not having this tactical overview makes combat both more cinematic and more realistic. It also drastically cuts down on the time players spend strategizing during combat. Since they don't have the exact detail of everything that is going on, they will instead use their limited information and make the most out of that. Most often, they will try to overcome the enemy that is right in front of them, and if they manage that, they take a look around and help whichever of their allies is nearest by flanking the enemy the ally is fighting against. Now, as a GM, you need to keep track of what is going on. But I find that in my games with a limited number of players and monsters, it's easy enough to keep track of everyone's position in my head. And if the situation becomes more complicated, I will use a simple sketch behind my GM screen to keep track of everyone's position. Really, using a piece of paper to keep track of everyone's position is easy enough. Just sketch a bit of terrain. Maybe there's a cart, they're going into an ambush on the road. So we'll have a cart. There'll be two horses. Maybe you've got hit points for them. So horse 1, horse 2. And then you can say goblins come from here, 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 here. We've got Joe, Bess, Henry, and Bob. And then you can just say, yeah, like Goblin 1 and Goblin 2 are going here, 3, 4 here. There's an archer over here, shooting that way. Another archer over here, shooting that way. And then if this character moves, if Bob moves, just scratch him out, point where he is moving. And there you go. And you can also just keep track of the monster's hit points right here on the map. So Goblin 2, 5 points of damage, 10, and he's dead. I will explain more tricks I use to make the most out of Theater of the Mind in a future video. So if you are interested in that, consider subscribing to my channel. For now, what do you use? Theater of the Mind or miniature combat? What do you think is better? Fight out the battle in the comments below. Thanks for watching and keep fighting.